Welcome to Common Home Conversations Beyond UN75, a series by the Planetary Podcast. In Common Home Conversations, you will hear from leading global experts on how the proposal of recognizing the existence of an intangible global common without borders can change our relationship with our planet. The Common Home of Humanity has proposed an ambitious new global pact for the environment. The adverse effects of climate change span across borders and beyond territories. Recognizing the Earth system as a common heritage of humankind is the first step in restoring a stable climate, a visible manifestation of a well-functioning Earth system. This proposal's cascading effects would be systemic and tremendously impact international relations and economics, opening the doors to restoring a well-functioning Earth system. Common Home Conversations is the place to discuss a new social contract between society, economy, and the Earth system. Now, here is your host, founder and CEO of the Planetary Press, Kimberly White.
Hello and welcome to Common Home Conversations. Today we are joined by Karl Burkart, the co-founder and managing director of One Earth. Thank you for joining us today, Karl.
Thanks. It's great to be here talking to you.
Can you tell us more about One Earth and the focus of your work there?
I'm the managing director of One Earth, and we are philanthropic initiative, particularly focused on the science policy interface for the three Rio conventions. And we are running correspondingly, roughly, three major scientific models that we support, with leading scientists around the world contributing to those three models. The first big one is the climate and energy transition model, which was published last year in the form of a very dense 500-page book called Achieving the Paris Climate Agreement Goals, which was authored by 17 leading climate and energy scientists and is now being widely cited. And that was really to look at how we can we, and if so, how can we stay below the 1.5 C threshold of global temperature rise? The second model is called the Global Safety Net, which was just published on Friday in Science Advances. That was a 2.5-year or plus effort, very large spatial analysis, the first global scale analysis of biologically important land. And one of the component products coming out of it is you could say a set of recommended area-based targets for the upcoming UN Biodiversity Convention. So that's the second Rio Convention. So what it does is it shows what are all the different types of land that can contribute to ecosystem services and biodiversity by country. This third model will be really contributing to looking at how we feed 10 billion people sustainably on the planet.
So today we seem to have gone from climate deniers to an attitude of it's already too late. Do you think we have the science and technology available today to form the solutions to stabilize the climate and keep warming at 1.5 degrees?
Yes, I love this question because it is the answer is absolutely yes. We have the technology, and it's not just the technology solved and sort of we need to now go into production. It's like we have the technology. It's as Obama would have said, shovel ready. We have it's sitting on the shelves. And in the climate model, in the energy transition model we supported, according to that model, we need to go from about 20% renewable energy today to about 56% globally, and that varies by region by 2030. So this is relatively straightforward. We know exactly how to do it. It's using technologies that are now battle tested for 10 or more years, and are scaling quickly and becoming cheaper by the minute. So really, it's not the technology that's missing for the energy transition; it's the dollars. And in the climate model, we have the back of envelope summary budget required for the transition I just mentioned is about 1.3 trillion a year, roughly, and that's less than 1/3 what governments spend today subsidizing fossil fuels. which are causing global warming. So for like less than a third of what we're paying to destroy the planet, we could transition energy with technology, create tons of jobs, be great for the economy. It would increase energy security as well, and it would reduce health risks associated with fossil fuels and climate change. So it's win-win isn't the right word. It's like win-win-win-win-win. It's like 5 wins if we did that. And it's just a matter of really political will at this point, moving the dollars.
So governments have been creating commitments and new targets to combat climate change, while at the same time, as you just said, propping up the fossil fuel industry with trillions of dollars in subsidies, adding to the climate crisis. Do you think the COVID-19 economic recovery efforts are an opportunity to shift away from business as usual and toward cleaner, greener energy?
I would say it's not just, definitely, and not just on the energy side, but also the nature-based solutions side. I'm seeing a lot coming from governments, especially the EU has been a big leader in this, and they've announced several commissions on sort of a green recovery. I think that COVID did 2 things. One thing it did, which of course has positive and negative, it slammed the brakes on the global economy. Like it was like you're driving in your car and a kid runs in front of you and you have to slam on your brakes in full stop. And that happened. So it's sort of like all these conversations that were happening, and there was going to be a climate convention, there was going to be a biodiversity convention, there was going to be this big UN summit, all these things, just everything went on hold. The results are kind of coming in now. We'll see what happens. Anywhere from 9 to 17% reduction in carbon emissions this year. We have to wait, obviously, for the postmortem, but we think it'll probably be somewhere in the middle, like maybe 12, 13% of a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, which is, actually more than what we needed to do in terms of being on the 1.5C track. So slamming on the brakes got us on the 1.5C course. Now, the question is, are we going to just slam on the gas pedal now? And I mean that literally, right? Because we have to also convert make our transportation system much cleaner. And I think that slamming on the brakes gave us this pause, and a lot of people to kind of start getting their ducks in a row about starting to look at recovery packages that could then be targeted towards sustainable and green infrastructure, energy, and nature-based solutions. I think the other thing that I saw with COVID is that just the awareness of nature, how important nature is. Nature's always been hard to sell as a serious issue because somehow climate change just sounded more technical. I mean, it was very technical and serious, and a lot of technical and serious people started 20 years ago working on the climate convention, but for some reason the biodiversity convention was sort of left as this really playing second fiddle in another room, and kind of you had your sort of hippie organizations really fighting for nature, but it was like this sort of technical serious people didn't really get it. And I think COVID made a lot of people realize what happens when you start to unravel the natural infrastructure that is providing the ecosystem services that the entire planet requires to exist. When you lose that, you start pulling out these threads and unraveling and unleashing things like zoonotic diseases, which are diseases that transfer from animals. But we know that the loss of biodiversity and loss of nature means increases in also vector-borne diseases, which are carried by insects. So nature is our shield that keeps humanity really in an safe operating space. So I think that's been a big awareness also. And why that was timely is because both the climate convention and the biodiversity convention got pushed a year ish. I mean, biodiversity convention will be next spring. Climate convention will be next fall. So it's kind of given us a internationally, given us a breathing space to really, really think about this. So I think that's a positive.
So you're one of the authors of the Global Deal for Nature. Can you elaborate more on this and explain what targets should be set to combat the extinction crisis?
Yeah, so actually the Global Deal for Nature was a paper really laying out the sort of the theoretical underpinnings of and the methodology of what became the global safety net. So they can be thought of as a pair. The Global Deal for Nature was released last year, and that was basically a very initial analysis of the remaining natural, semi-natural lands, and how important those lands are for both preserving biodiversity, but also for solving climate change. And that paper had the endorsement of over, I think we're up to 150 indigenous groups, because one of the main points this paper makes is that when you really look for the most rich, biodiverse, rich land and the land storing the most carbon, it ends up being indigenous lands. And those lands need more protection and more, in particular, in the form of land tenure given to the indigenous people who are managing those lands, to prevent land grabs and illegal logging and things like that. So so roughly the Global Deal for Nature divided it into those two categories I mentioned, sort of 30% kind of initially really needing urgently for biodiversity, and then another 20% for what they call climate stabilization or intactness. Across all of those lands, we later found out in the global safety net, roughly 35%, I can give you the statistic exactly, it's 40% of the biologically, sort of the biodiversity, the high biodiversity lands are overlap with indigenous territories. And then about 30% roughly of the additional stabilization areas overlap with indigenous lands. So we really see just how important territorial rights for indigenous people are. And so in parallel, there was a lot of excitement around the release of Global Deal for Nature, and a petition was launched. And I think there's about 3 or 4 million signatures on there now to really call for this bigger protection target of 50%. And, the global safety net has which just was released. That really creates kind of the map, if you will, of what we were recommending in the Global Deal for Nature. And that map, you can kind of zoom in and look at the ecoregion level or the country level and get a finer sense of how that divides up. That's how the two work together.
That's really interesting. We recently published an article on a new study that also supports what you just said. It found protecting indigenous peoples' lands is essential to curbing biodiversity loss. There's a lot of studies on this, and it's imperative that we recognize this now and ensure their land rights, and moving forward, they should be a central voice in environmental governance.
Yeah, totally agree. And I mean, actually, that really... Yeah, I just tag on to that I don't know. I don't think that paper did, but if it hasn't come out, we should do this paper, but you really can't do 1.5C without protecting indigenous lands. There's just so much carbon stored on those lands, and there's a lot of these lands are threatened, as we see in Brazil and other places. So yeah, essential for both conventions, I would say. And, in terms of the governance, I mean, it would be really interesting, I think, if you have a higher order legal theory around the idea of commons. The interesting thing about indigenous lands, and also I would say local, so all communally held lands. And there's we heard on the September 15th, there's a new paper coming out on communally held lands. We believe that roughly 50% of the world's land is communally held. So a big part of that is indigenous lands, but there's also a big part that is what we call local communities or traditional communities who don't necessarily identify themselves or identified by government as quote unquote indigenous, but have been on the land in some cases for hundreds, if not thousands of years, managing the land. So if half the planet is managed communally already by indigenous people and local communities, they really need to be at the table when thinking through this new legal theory around commons, because they're actually practicing the commons right now, and those and their work is actually in some way, you could say, subsidizing all of us, because without indigenous lands and the ecosystem services they provide, we'd probably be at, I don't know what, 2 or 3 degrees Celsius already. If you look at the vast stores of carbon on their lands, and they do so much of a better job conserving those lands, and a lot of times the national parks or government designation. So, I think it's a very exciting thing. We'd love to help facilitate that in some way, however we can. But there's a lot of actually experts already practicing their own version of legal theory around communally held lands. And I think there's probably a lot to learn from that to scale that up.
So let's dive into the global safety net a bit more. What can you tell us about this project, and what are you hoping to achieve?
Yeah, I think I probably covered some of it, just explaining the global analysis. It is just roughly, it's a little more complicated than this, but it's 11 different global analyses that were compiled. So I'd say it's like, we like to say it's sort of, I used to be my former career before I went into all this environmental science and technology work, I was an architect, and you can't build a building of any significance without blueprint. And we didn't have a blueprint for what do we need to do to save the biosphere, essentially. What does that look like on a map? And so the global safety net, you could say, was sort of like the artist. It wasn't really an artist, science produced it, but it was sort of the rough sketch, if you will, of the blueprint to save our biosphere. And it also happened to confirm that finding that it's 50.4% of land area, inclusive of existing protected areas, is we would consider important for biodiversity and climate stabilization. So we have now the beginning of a blueprint, and with science, really, in some ways, you don't really want to have any agenda. You just want to get the science out there. And I think that was our thinking on this. We just need to get it out there, because even if you want to, people may disagree on what some of the findings were, or some of the spatial analysis techniques used to show, that's good, because, think about it. In the climate convention, there's literally thousands of scientists producing hundreds and hundreds of models. And all those models, because there's hundreds of brilliant scientists working around the world producing their own model, they get to be compiled, and we get a really, really accurate sense of all, with contributions from all these different scientists. So global safety net is just the first one. We hope that there would be dozens more analyses like this that would present their own prioritizations. It could be at the country level, the region level, the global level. But we want this to be out there just to start the beginning of these global models, which hopefully will inform the convention, over the next 10 years. But, at some point you just got to get the science out and let people react to it. It was a difficult peer review process. It took a really long time, and we're using some novel techniques. And so, like all things, it's the beginning. It's also at 1 kilometer resolution, which is fairly crude. You can't use it to actually create a land plan, but you can use it to drive fairly accurate statistics. And so, I would say all what we'd say here, the country level quote unquote targets that you can see in the rankings on the website. Website, by the way, is globalsafetynet.app. And that is, we built that in partnership with Google Earth. So it's just a way to display the data. You can see that there are, every country is different. There is a different amount and different types of all of those different classifications I mentioned. There are different amounts of those in each country. And so it's up to each country to figure out how to prioritize the protection of lands. We would strongly advocate for really pushing this 30% that is identified as being of particular importance for biodiversity. Is that really that needs to be protected like yesterday, in our view. But the science is the science, so we got to just let it out there and have people react to it.
So, do you think it's possible to achieve these major conservation and restoration efforts spanning 50% of lands and oceans and boosting nature-based solutions without a legal framework within which to develop global policies?
I would say that we are, as human civilization or civilizations, however you want to say it, the human presence on Earth is, the longevity of that is really a question mark at this point. We are on the verge of being snuffed out. I mean, if we hit, 1.5 degrees in global average temperature rise. Now, to point out, we're already, in many regions of the Earth, we're already at 1.5 degrees Celsius. So like Australia, California now, was just yesterday at 112 degrees in Los Angeles. So the Earth is warming in different rates. Particularly worrisome is the extraordinary warming happening on both poles, Antarctica and the Arctic. We've really got a gun to our heads because we're at 1.1 degrees Celsius global average temperature rise, and we're seeing collapse of major ice sheets and fires that were not predicted to happen at the scale they're happening right now. So we're pretty sure at 1.5 degrees Celsius, at least One Earth's position is a lot more. We're a lot more worried than the current consensus position on the reality of 1.5 degrees Celsius. There's one paper I like to cite that shows that at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we'd likely lose 8% of our arable land. So, imagine 6 million people migrating out of Syria because of prolonged drought and aridification of land, arable land because of prolonged drought there. Imagine that times 50. Can the world sustain 50 Syrian refugee crises happening simultaneously? Combined with sea level rise, combined with fires, combined with all these other things? No, I do not think so. So 1.5 C is an existential threat that is unlike, anything that humanity has ever faced. So the problem is the UN, which is very young, we have to remind ourselves, it's only 75 years old. So it's about the same age as my, one of my grandparents, one of my parents, right? So, and a lot of people's grandparents. So it was this first attempt at bringing the world's governments together to look at multilateral agreements. The problem is the legal theory wasn't really there. So, even when we have conventions that get ratified, a lot of times everyone walks away and no one does much, or they go halfway to what their commitment was. So I'm really hopeful that, we definitely need the emergence of a new legal theory around the commons, is going to be a game changer. I don't understand it enough to know all the ways it could be implemented, but I do know that this conversation has to start now because it's very hard to believe that we are going to stay at this point. We are going to stay below 1.5 C with just leaning on government policy and the Paris Agreement.
How would the common home of humanity contribute to reaching these much needed goals and help to avoid these existential threats?
The common home has the right framing. They're thinking about the problem at the scale that it needs to be thought of. You cannot solve, as the saying goes, you cannot solve a vexing problem within the confines of that problem. You have to go outside of the problem. And I think that's what common home does, is it's leaping outside of the confines of national and even multilateral policymaking and going one higher order up. And I think that is the thinking that has to happen now. I don't know what would be involved in getting governments on board. But I know that we have to start the conversation. So it's really great they're leading that charge. And I think the idea of the commons having rights is a way to bring on board bigger stakeholders. Because right now it's mostly, it's like really like super progressive NGOs and indigenous groups and youth groups forming these class action lawsuits, which is a great precedent. But to onboard, governments that's what we have to do. So I think that bigger legal theory that the Common Home is working on are really going to be important for that.
On the Global Deal for Nature, you cite a study called An Ecoregion-Based Approach to Protect Half the Terrestrial Realm. And a key concept in that paper is that each of the world's 846 terrestrial ecoregions needs its own plan shared by countries whose boundaries overlap its geopolitical extent. How will the Common Home of Humanity help to achieve this?
Yeah, I would love to, I would so love to explore that. With you guys, because we have the 846 ecoregions, and 846 is a lot, and the issue with and these are land ecoregions. So we have terrestrial ecoregions, freshwater ecoregions, and marine or coastal ecoregions, and the ecoregions, the 2017 ecoregions paper was a game changer. It identifies the 846 land or terrestrial ecoregions. The issue with those is that a lot of times you have one ecoregion that's very intertwined with another. And one example of that may be if you go to Wyoming in the United States, where you have the grasslands meeting the Rockies, where the Northern Rockies, and you have this entanglement of grasslands and for the forests that are there, the mountainous forests. So what we realized is actually for a global framework, for our own work, which is focused on science, implementing science to achieve the goals of the conventions, we needed a bioregional, like a slightly larger or a higher order combination of ecoregions. So that we're calling the bioregions. So it's Bioregions 2020, and that's going to be coming out in a few weeks. And there's 184 of them. So it's actually a similar number to countries. And we like to call them, if nature got to draw a map of the world, this is what it might look like. And these are 184 of nature's countries. And those are groupings of ecoregions confined by major geomorphic structures. So that's basins, mountain ranges, coastal plains, things like that. And so it's a novel biogeographical framework, which we think will really allow for collaboration between those stakeholder governments that overlap the bioregion. So it's taking the ecoregions idea, and the ecoregions are the building blocks, right? So no ecoregion is divided up. They're like the Lego blocks, if you will, of the bioregions. And then the bioregions also include adjacent coastal and freshwater areas. So we're not limiting the field of study to just the land alongside the river, but also the river. And we're not limiting it to just, say, the coastal plain adjacent to the ocean, but also the coastal areas off the ocean. Because if you're thinking about food security, for example, you can't really do that. You have to do that at a bioregional level, because you have fishermen providing seafood, and then you have the land area that's able to provide crops, and there might be livestock and rangelands activity. All of these things have to be thought of together, not separately. So that's why we think the bioregions could be, a really interesting framework. So it'd be really cool to collaborate with you on that. And if it's a useful structure, again, we're just putting it out in Creative Commons because we want everyone to be able to access it. But it will, on our website, we'll be rolling out on the One Earth website if you go to explore, you'll see a bioregions, and we'll have I think it's the first ever spherical map that you can click on. And so it's a clickable spherical map, which I'm being told hasn't been done. I'm sure someone's done it, but you'll be able to click on and then explore all about the bioregion you live in and the ecoregions that make up that bioregion. So that we're kind of just pushing that out as a content and information just out in the Creative Commons. But we would love it if it could be adapted in more ways to be used for this idea of bioregional, the bioregional commons, which I think is kind of the direction we're going to need to go in.
Absolutely. I know I'm looking forward to checking out that map.
It's pretty cool. It's really beautiful. It's very colorful, and the developers who built it are pretty badass. So we're looking forward to getting out there.
I'm excited to see how this collaboration plays out and all of the great things you guys will be doing in the near future. So that's it for today's interview. Thank you for joining us, Karl.
Yeah, thank you. It was fun talking to you. Good questions.
All right, and there you have it. The solutions to the climate crisis already exist. By utilizing the latest science and technology, we can limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by protecting and restoring half of the planet's lands and oceans and making the shift to renewable energy. The legal framework proposed by the Common Home of Humanity can help achieve these ambitious goals. That is all for today, and thank you for joining us for this episode of Common Home Conversations Beyond UN75. Please subscribe, share, and be sure to tune in next week to continue the conversation with our special guest, Janine Yazzie, co-convener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group on Sustainable Development. And visit us at www.theplanetarypress.com for more episodes and the latest news in sustainability, climate change, and the environment.